All right, fantastic. So my name is David Binetti. I'm the CEO and co-founder of VoteAsIn. VoteAsIn is an online network of registered voters, and we try to provide tools for ordinary people to engage in the political process in a very simple and meaningful way. I was also the co-founder of something called USA.gov. Thanks, Christine. USA.gov is the central search portal for the United States government, official website of the United States government, and we think is probably the first example of online transparency, e-transparency in government operations. I sort of have always been in the intersection of technology and politics. In '95, I did a website that put campaign finance documents online. Won some cool awards, because if you could just code at all in '95, you could get an internet award. But it sort of kindled this passion of mine, making the information available to larger numbers of people so they can make informed decisions. And that, of course, is always the starting point for any real meaningful action. So I'm going to talk today a little bit is about just a little bit of touching upon history, a little bit about the role of technology as a disruptor at different points in history and how these sometimes can combine to create inflection points. And I'm going to talk about one inflection point that's about 50 years old, and then I'm going to talk about the next inflection point, which of course is happening right now, and what the potential meaning is as we look at the future of civic engagement. And then lastly, I'm going to share what some of those implications are for the future. Not to make any super declarative statements, but to be a little bit bold so that you have an opportunity to think about what exactly does that mean when these things change. So let's go ahead and start right at the beginning. And why don't you go ahead and click the next slide if you don't mind? Perfect. So Article 1, Section 2, Clause 3 of the United States Constitution signifies that the number of representatives shall not exceed 1 in every 30,000. Now, of course, this is what the framers intended to have the people's house, so there would be proportional representation in the lower chamber, the voice of the people. And what we actually have is that the population grew, and for a period of time, they actually did use apportionment to add representatives to keep that proportion relatively the same. And then 100 years ago, they passed the Apportionment Act of 1911. That fixed the House of Representatives at 435. But the population has gone up and up and up. And now that 1 in 30,000, which the framers intended as a voice of the people, an actual representation of democracy, is now at 1 in 700,000. 20 times increase. Incidentally, significantly more than what the Senate was at the time of the first Congress, when it had 65 members in the House of Representatives. Now, this is fascinating. What are the implications for democracy? What are the implications for the voice of the people when you have that level of disparity? Well, as you might imagine, you have a certain discussion between the voters on one side and their elected representatives, representative democracy on the other side, and there is an intrinsic carrying capacity. That sort of is the transportation technology enables, communication technology enables, but it sort of starts there, that you can actually have a reasonable conversation, of course, what the framers intended. But when you exceed that carrying capacity, as in any natural econometric system, intermediaries come in to fill the gaps, to help exchange the information, to serve as a sort of meta-representation, representing the representers. And of course, this is perfectly natural. So you would expect to have lobbyists and union organizing groups and industry organizing groups. And then, of course, a corollary, the congressional leadership itself, which then represents the Congress as another meta layer. But what happens is that these layers of abstraction that get built on one another, they actually have a tendency to become self-serving. Self-serving, right? And this actually happens a lot throughout history, where they stop sort of representing their original goal and start to become more, what can I do for me as a matter of self-interest and this intersection that I've created. So when you look at communication and how this impacts these sort of points in history, of course, you start with the massive disruption of pamphlets in the printing press, which was the progenitor of the American Revolution itself, and Patrick Henry and the Federalist Papers, and all these things that got all that information and stirred people up and engaged them to action. And then, of course, another massive change and shift was the move to broadcast media, where you really extended that, this new distribution mechanism that could go to many, many, many more people, increasing the carrying capacity of communication. Yes, but yet again, another layer of abstraction. And the very interesting thing about all of these communication techniques is that they're all asymmetric. So yes, it's possible that people could disseminate now with the new technologies, and anybody with a computer is able to share that information. But I think the thing that makes it truly powerful is that it is no longer one way. And we've had blogs for a couple of years. People are able to actually share their information. What happens when the people can talk back in a measurable way, in a trackable way, in a way where their actions have a tangible, notable result? That, to me, is the real massive change that we are seeing today, and I will talk about that in a bit. But what I want to talk about right now is an inflection point that I thought really had its mark made in 1964. And there's, of course, a famous ad, the Daisy ad, that contributed to Lyndon Baines Johnson's landslide defeat of Barry Goldwater. It was quite explosive, literally, but what it really signified is this sort of advent and this explosion of political advertising through this fundamentally rich and asymmetric medium of television. And ever since then, this centralized message, command and control approach to political policymaking and campaigning has dominated. It's become absolutely ascendant. And people have spent their entire lives making sure that that message is centralized, the narrative is clear, it is concise, it is hard-hitting, and it is absolutely 100% tightly controlled. Deviation from that message is punished severely. And any people here that may have actually worked in a political campaign know that you are never supposed to talk to the press, and if they do, that there's all these sorts of things that are sort of built into it, that you will never deviate from the message, and everything falls from that. So what has happened when we see this extremely expensive medium, thank you. It has gone, in 1960, what was a total spend on all public policy and campaigning of $10 million to what is estimated in 2012 to be a $10 billion market. All based on, fundamentally, command and control message delivery. Primarily, television, less so direct mail. Anybody who's checking their mailboxes recently, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Incredibly inefficient, one-way message pounding mechanisms. And this is extremely expensive. So if you are an elected official and you want to actually hold office, run, seek, and hold office, you have to spend a huge amount of money. So that interesting sort of intersection of those intermediaries in the middle help support that. So this is pretty interesting. So the left side, you may have seen this sort of zipping around the internet. I thought it was pretty cool. What Occupy Wall Street protesters are upset about: large corporations have way too much power. What Tea Party members are upset about: the government has way too much power. And the intersection is what they both believe, that large corporations lobby for the government to have more power. And in return, the government enacts laws and elections favorable to large corporations. And that's absolutely true. Absolutely true. And what makes it a requirement for people that want to seek and hold office is to have to play that game. I actually think that's changing. Next slide. What we have now is another technology revolution. Now, I consider this a relationship technology shift. Yes, we've had the internet, and as we saw when the internet first came out, it was promised to be this sort of magnificent equalizer that everybody could sort of speak, and I think that it was, obviously had a huge impact on the discussion and public debate. But I think the piece that was missing, that we've only recently started to see, is this ability to be able to form relationships, to be able to connect with other people that agree with you on issues, and to form huge amounts of power that come from the sum of the parts being greater, right? And the really great thing about this is that the marginal effectiveness increases with the number of people that are participating. You don't have that same effect on mass media, just sending the same message to the different number of people. But in this case, the more people that participate in the system, the more valuable the overall system becomes. That's self-perpetuating, and it gives me a great deal of hope that this can be a fundamentally transformative technology. So next. Let's just do a real quick quiz on something that I think is pretty important. So, who led the fight against apartheid? Nelson Mandela, right. And who led the Polish solidarity movement? That's exactly right. And you could pick either revolution, but let's choose the most current one. Who led that one? Boris Yeltsin, right? Okay, next. Who led the Tunisian revolution? What person? Well, the Egyptian revolution. who was the person that centralized all that? Oh, I know. Who's in charge of the Tea Party and who's in charge of Occupy Wall Street? What person? What one person? Maybe. That's okay. Oh, one time I actually wish I had bigger ears. No, this is something that's really powerful. You think about these massive movements, these sea changes of governments and power structures and military and entire economies turned over that always had been led by a single man or woman. Truly, right? I mean, yes, there were supporting infrastructures and there was all sorts of people that contributed in their own way, but most of the time, you either could identify, or the media would identify for you, one person that was in charge from which all the information flows. That's changing. That's changing. That's not going to be the case. So what are some of the implications when you actually look at self-organizing intermediaries, where these platforms now allow people to come together, share their views in a very transparent way, in a very symmetrical way, in a discoverable way, where they can articulate their power, measurable ways to be able to make an impact. That's very, 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 very different than what we've seen in terms of how revolutions are organized, in terms of how public policy decisions are made, in terms of how we choose and elect our leaders. So, we are, as a company, trying to help enable that, and we think that there are some important things that come from that when you have to ask yourself the question, who leads leaderless revolutions? Now, the answer, of course, is you. And the power of your ideas, and the ability to spread your message, the ability to persuade others to join your cause. That's an incredibly powerful concept, but it doesn't have to come from just one person. So, what are some of the implications when direct relationships are possible? Just think for a minute. The $10 billion that is spent on command and control message, how powerful is that 30-second attack ad going to be if you have a direct relationship with that person who holds office, with that candidate who's seeking office, that can engage with you directly, answer your questions, share an experience with them? So then, by implication, what happens to the power of money that has to support all of that? Something to think about. I think that people, and in particular young people, have an expectation now of engagement. This is not something that's just something that should be done. It must be done. And it must be authentic. Things that are inauthentic fall away. They don't have any value in this new relationship-based economy. So what are the implications of that when you have to consider that the things that I say, which are permanent, it must come from me as an individual, staking my reputation on the line, saying, I back this matters to me. What are the implications for the civility in civil discourse? Something to think about. Next, please. Voting is necessary, but insufficient. Voting is the authenticity that says, I matter, I am engaged, you should listen to me because I am doing my part. But it is not enough. It is not enough. It's not enough to just take actions on election day. It's what you do between elections that is going to matter the most. These tools make that possible in, again, a powerful, symmetric, measurable, and attainable way. Something to think about. Outfriending will become more important than outspending. Kathy Sierra, who came up with that phrase, but think about that. Think about what happens when all the money in the world can't be spent. When you have hundreds of robocalls trying to come down to a relatively small number of people. The message is ineffective. The political ads are dropping in effectiveness. Direct mail is just filling up landfills. It's going to be gone as an industry in 10 years. It will be replaced in the relationship economy with being able to forge these relationships. That's something really important and something to think about. And when you consider this, an average congressional district is represented roughly by about 800,000 persons, right? So of that 800,000 persons, roughly 400,000 are registered to vote. Competitive district, right? Roughly. Of that 400,000, roughly 200,000 will actually vote in any given election. Of that 200,000, roughly 80,000 will always vote one way, and roughly 80,000 will always vote the other way. So the remaining 40,000, if you get 20,000 plus one, you win. Now on social media, That's an average of 37 conversations per day during the course of the cycle. That means it's attainable. It's possible. It actually can matter to be able to use these relationship tools to win elections. That's a super powerful concept. And I think that the more valuable that becomes, and the more the carrying capacity of these symmetric relationships improve, the more that those tools will be used to bring additional people into the process. Something to think about. Supernodes will appear and will serve as the new power brokers. They will become what Walter Cronkite was in the large mass media environment. Those people will actually not be motivated by money as much, some may, but I think because that inauthenticity will be exposed fairly quickly, that will fall away. Time, attention, and most importantly, engagement. Supplanting that relationship, making it true, making it real. All right? I think the implications for large-scale national campaigns clearly is going to be difficult. Large-scale states, clearly difficult. But I think particularly where all politics is local, all politics will become social. And those are a very powerful concept. Next slide. I think this is fairly, well, I'll just mention it. I think it's pretty obvious to me. I think parties in this sense will fracture as things become more about collections of interests as opposed to the reason they existed before, which is to bring everybody together across wide geographies. Leadership structure, concordantly, will also diminish. Next slide, please. And those who engage will on benefit reap the benefits, will on balance reap the benefits. It is very difficult for an entire infrastructure that has lived on an entire command and control structure to cede that control to social media. But those who do and take the plunge and realize that other people can carry their message for them will reap incredible rewards. But it may not all be good. And I will just leave on this note. You know, the very famous Federalist number 10, written by Madison, Federalist Papers, of course, supporting the adoption of the Constitution, talked about the power of faction. It's one of the most famous pieces of political literature in American history, and obviously I focused on the United States here. So understand that caveat. But it says, when you have all these disparate interests working together, is that good for democracy or does it make democracy suffer? I think that's an open question, but I think that the fascinating, on balance, that the problems of democracy are best served by more democracy will eventually play itself out. And I, for one, am excited on what the future will bring. Thank you so much for the invitation tonight.